Welcome to today's episode of Anthropology Unleashed, where we dive into one of humanity's most incredible survival stories, a tale written in mud, water, and sheer determination. Imagine waking up to find that the world you knew has vanished beneath rising water. The hunting grounds where your ancestors tracked mammoths for generations are now shallow seas. The caves that sheltered your people for thousands of years lie drowned beneath hundreds of feet of ocean. The land bridge that connected continents has become a flooded channel. Every familiar landmark, every known trail, every trusted campsite gone, swallowed by an advancing tide that seems unstoppable. This wasn't a nightmare or a myth. This was reality for our ancestors living at the end of the last ice age, roughly 15,000 to 8,000 years ago. As massive glaciers melted, sea levels rose by more than 400 feet, reshaping coastlines, flooding river valleys, and transforming the geography of the entire planet. Millions of square miles of land that humans had called home disappeared beneath the waves. It was one of the most dramatic environmental transformations in human history, and people had to survive it without maps, without boats that could cross oceans, without any understanding of why the water kept rising. Yet they did. More than that, they adapted, innovated, and ultimately thrived. They learned to navigate flooded landscapes, to cross treacherous waters, to build settlements in places their ancestors could never have imagined. They created pathways through a drowned world, establishing trade routes, migration corridors, and settlements that would shape human civilization for millennia to come. How did they do it? That's the story we're about to explore. Chapter 1. When the ice began to weep 20,000 years ago, the Earth was a vastly different planet than the one we inhabit today. If you could somehow travel back to that frozen world and look down from space, you would barely recognize it. Massive ice sheets, some more than 2 miles thick, covered much of North America, Northern Europe, and Asia. These glaciers held so much of Earth's water locked in frozen form that global sea levels were nearly 400 feet lower than today. Coastlines extended dozens or even hundreds of miles beyond their current positions. Land bridges connected continents that are now separated by seas. The world map looked nothing like what we know. This was the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, when glaciers reached their greatest extent. Nearly a third of Earth's land surface lay buried under ice. But the remarkable thing about this frozen world wasn't how different it was from today. It is how normal it seemed to the humans living through it. For the people of 20,000 years ago, this was simply how the world had always been. Their parents lived in this world. Their grandparents lived in this world. Their ancestors, stretching back hundreds of generations, knew nothing else. The ice was permanent, eternal, unchanging. Or so everyone believed. But around 18,000 years ago, something began to shift. The climate started warming. The change was gradual at first, almost imperceptible within a human lifetime. Perhaps elders noticed that winters weren't quite as harsh as they remembered from their youth. Maybe hunters observed that snow melted slightly earlier each spring. But these changes were subtle, the kind of thing people might attribute to ordinary year-to-year variation rather than recognizing as the beginning of a fundamental transformation. The glaciers, however, knew something was changing. Under the relentless assault of warmer temperatures, these mountains of ice began their long, slow retreat. Ice that had accumulated over tens of thousands of years started melting. At first, the melt was modest, a few inches per year, barely noticeable. But as centuries passed, the rate accelerated. Trickles became streams. Streams became rivers. Rivers became torrents of meltwater that carved new channels through landscapes and poured into the oceans. The truly catastrophic events came when massive ice dams, which had held back enormous glacial lakes, suddenly failed. Picture a lake hundreds of miles across, dammed by walls of ice thousands of feet thick. Now imagine that dam giving way. The water doesn't seep out gradually. it explodes outward in a cataclysm of unimaginable violence. These glacial lake outburst floods, called Juklaups by scientists who study them, released more water in a matter of days than the Amazon River carries in a year. They carved new valleys, rearranged entire river systems, and sent massive pulses of fresh water into the oceans. One of the most spectacular of these floods occurred when glacial Lake Missoula, a massive body of water in what is now Montana, broke through its ice dam around 15,000 years ago. The flood that followed was one of the largest in Earth's history, with peak discharges estimated at nearly 15 million cubic feet per second, more than 10 times the combined flow of all the rivers on Earth today. This apocalyptic deluge carved the channeled scablands of eastern Washington, a landscape so bizarre that geologists initially refused to believe water could have created it. But this wasn't the only such catastrophe. Similar outburst floods occurred across North America, Europe, and Asia, wherever glacial lakes had formed against retreating ice sheets. Each flood was a disaster for any human communities in its path, but it was also a symptom of something even larger and more consequential. The sea was rising. As meltwater poured into the oceans from thousands of glaciers worldwide, sea levels began a relentless rise that would continue for thousands of years. The rate varied, sometimes a few feet per century, other times much faster during periods when massive ice sheets collapsed or giant glacial lakes emptied catastrophically. But the overall trend was unmistakable and unstoppable. The ocean was reclaiming land that had been dry for tens of thousands of years. For the humans living through this transformation, the rising water must have seemed like the end of the world. Imagine you're part of a coastal settlement 15,000 years ago. Your people have lived in this place for as long as anyone can remember. The stories passed down through countless generations describe the same landscape, the same coastline, the same hunting grounds. This is home, constant and eternal. But then you start to notice changes. That rocky outcrop where you used to gather shellfish is now underwater at high tide. The beach where children played has narrowed. The freshwater spring your people depended on has become brackish, contaminated by salt water. Over your lifetime, the changes accelerate. That island that was a 2-hour walk at low tide now requires swimming. The coastal plain where you hunted deer is becoming a marsh. The river mouth where you caught fish has moved inland, and strange new channels cut through land that was solid ground when you were a child. You try to tell your children about the world you knew when you were young, but they can barely comprehend it. To them, the rising water is simply reality, not a change from some previous state. And your grandchildren, if you live long enough to see them grow, will know a world even more transformed, where the old hunting grounds exist only in stories that must sound like myths. This wasn't a localized phenomenon affecting one region. The rising seas were global, affecting every coastline on Earth. In Southeast Asia, a vast area known as Sundaland, which had connected mainland Asia to Indonesia, was gradually flooded, transforming a unified landmass into thousands of scattered islands. In northern Europe, the North Sea basin, once a marshy plain where humans and animals roamed, slowly filled with water. In North America, the Bering Land Bridge that had allowed the first humans to enter the Americas from Asia disappeared beneath the waves. The psychological impact of these changes on early human populations is difficult to overstate. Humans are creatures who need stability, who find comfort in familiar landscapes. The rising waters stole that stability. Every generation saw their world literally shrinking, the sea claiming more and more of the land. The sense of impermanence, of being unable to stop the advancing tide, must have been profoundly unsettling. Yet humans didn't simply accept their fate. The archaeological record shows something remarkable. Rather than retreating permanently inland and abandoning the coasts, people adapted. They learned to live with the changing shorelines. They developed new technologies for exploiting marine resources. They created ways to travel across the expanding waters. They built settlements designed to cope with flooding and rising seas. In short, they turned catastrophe into opportunity. Understanding how they did this requires us to first grasp the full scale of the transformation they faced. The sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age wasn't a single event but a complex process that unfolded over roughly 10,000 years, from about 18,000 years ago to about 8,000 years ago. The rate of rise varied dramatically during this period, with some centuries seeing only inches of increase, while others witnessed several feet or more. The most dramatic period came between 14,000 and 11,000 years ago, during a phase scientists call Meltwater Pulse 1a. During this roughly 500-year span, sea levels rose by 50 to 80 feet. That's more than half an inch per year on average, and probably much faster during peak periods. To put this in perspective, modern sea level rise due to climate change is currently about 1/8 of an inch per year, and this is causing serious concern worldwide. Our ancestors dealt with rates 4 to 8 times faster. The flooding wasn't just a matter of coastlines moving inland. Rising seas also transformed rivers, creating estuaries where none had existed before, and pushing the influence of tides miles upstream from previous limits. Freshwater springs near the coast became brackish or disappeared entirely as salt water invaded underground aquifers. Low-lying valleys filled with water, becoming bays and inlets. Islands that had been hills on a broader coastal plain found themselves cut off from the mainland, isolated by channels that grew wider and deeper with each passing generation. The climate changes that caused the ice to melt also brought other transformations. Temperature patterns shifted. Rainfall distributions changed. Ecosystems reorganized themselves as plants and animals responded to new conditions. The end of the Ice Age wasn't just about rising water. It was about a complete reshaping of the world humans had known. Different regions experienced these changes differently. In some areas, the coastline retreated slowly and relatively steadily, giving people time to adjust their settlement patterns and adapt their lifestyles. In other areas, catastrophic floods or rapid sea level rise forced sudden, desperate migrations. Some communities were able to maintain continuity, moving inland but keeping their cultural identity and accumulated knowledge intact. Others were shattered, their populations dispersed and their traditions lost. But everywhere, humans face the same fundamental challenge. How do you survive when the world itself is changing? How do you pass knowledge to the next generation when the landscape they inherit will be radically different from the one you knew? How do you build a life, establish a home, create stability in a world that's literally dissolving beneath your feet? The answer, as we'll explore, involved some of the most remarkable innovations in human prehistory. Our ancestors didn't just survive the flooding of the ancient world. They used it as an opportunity to spread across the planet, to develop new technologies, to establish trade networks and migration routes that would shape human civilization for thousands of years to come. They built paths across the flooded earth, and in doing so, they built the foundation of the modern world. The ice had begun to weep, and humanity would learn to navigate the tears. Chapter 2. The Drowning of Ancient Worlds. The land was called Doggerland, though the people who lived there never knew that name. It would be given thousands of years later by archaeologists studying the ghost of a lost country. 15,000 years ago, Doggerland was a vast landscape connecting what is now Britain to continental Europe. A rich territory of rolling hills, river valleys, lakes, and forests. It was prime real estate for Ice Age hunters, teeming with game animals and offering abundant plant resources. Thousands of people called it home, their settlements scattered across a land that stretched for hundreds of miles. Today, Doggerland lies beneath the North Sea, drowned by the rising waters that followed the Ice Age. Fishing trawlers occasionally bring up stone tools, mammoth bones, and other evidence of human habitation from what is now the seafloor. These artifacts are all that remain of communities that thrived for thousands of years before the ocean claimed their world. Doggerland's drowning is one of the most dramatic examples of how rising seas transformed the human world. But it's far from the only one. Sunderland in Southeast Asia was perhaps even more significant. At the last glacial maximum, modern-day Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and mainland Southeast Asia were connected by a vast tropical plain. This region may have been one of the most important centers of early human population, a crossroads where different groups met, traded, and intermarried. The climate was favorable, resources were abundant, and the landscape supported large human populations. As sea levels rose, Sunderland was progressively flooded. What had been a unified landmass became thousands of scattered islands. The transformation wasn't gradual, and many river valleys flooded rapidly, creating new seaways that divided populations that had been unified for millennia. By 8,000 years ago, Sunderland had essentially vanished. Its inhabitants either drowned, forced to migrate, or stranded on the newly created islands of Indonesia and Malaysia. The scale of human displacement caused by these floodings is difficult to comprehend. Modern estimates suggest that during the period of rapid sea level rise, hundreds of millions of acres of coastal land worldwide were inundated. While we don't know how many people lived in these coastal zones, archaeological evidence suggests that coastlines were prime human habitat during the Ice Age, just as they are today. The majority of human population was likely concentrated near coasts and in river valleys, exactly the areas most affected by flooding. Think about what this means. Modern refugee crises, caused by war or famine, displace millions of people and strain the resources of nations. The end of the Ice Age created a refugee crisis lasting thousands of years, affecting populations across the entire globe. People whose ancestors had occupied certain territories for hundreds of generations were forced to abandon their homes and move to unfamiliar lands. Conflicts over territory must have intensified as displaced populations pushed into areas already occupied by other groups. Yet remarkably, human civilization didn't collapse. Despite the catastrophic scale of environmental change, archaeological evidence shows continuous cultural development during this period. Stone tool technologies became more sophisticated. Art and symbolic expression flourished. Population numbers, far from declining, appear to have increased in many regions. How did humans not only survive, but thrive during this transformation? Part of the answer lies in the fact that while the flooding was catastrophic in the long term, year-to-year changes were often slow enough that people could adapt. Even during periods of rapid rise, the ocean advanced at most a few dozen feet per year. This wasn't like a sudden flood that destroys everything in hours. It was more like a chronic disease that slowly weakened the patient. Communities had time to notice the changes, to discuss responses, to plan migrations, and to adapt their lifestyles. Coastal settlements developed a peculiar pattern during this period. Rather than establishing permanent villages in one location, many groups adopted a strategy of serial relocation. They would build a settlement on the coast, exploit its resources for a generation or two, and then as the sea encroached, they would abandon it and build a new one slightly inland. Archaeological sites along ancient coastlines often show this pattern. Multiple occupation layers at different elevations, each representing a different generation settlement as they progressively retreated before the advancing ocean. This strategy required a different mindset than the attachment to specific places that characterizes many settled societies. Home wasn't a particular piece of ground, but rather a set of relationships, technologies, and cultural practices that could be transported. Your identity wasn't tied to a specific mountain or valley, but to your people, your knowledge, and your traditions. This flexibility may have been one of the key factors that allowed humans to survive such dramatic landscape changes. But not all areas flooded gradually. Some experienced catastrophic inundations that transformed landscapes overnight. The Black Sea flood hypothesis, though debated among scientists, suggests that around 7,600 years ago, rising Mediterranean waters breached a natural dam of what is now the Bosporus Strait, causing the Mediterranean to pour into the Black Sea basin. If this occurred as some researchers propose, the Black Sea as level would have risen dramatically, possibly by hundreds of feet, in a matter of months or years. Any human settlements around the former lakeshore would have been rapidly inundated. Similar catastrophic flooding events may have occurred in other locations. The Persian Gulf Basin, which was a river valley with human settlements during the Ice Age, filled relatively rapidly as sea levels rose. The flooding of this valley, which transformed it from dry land into a shallow sea, likely displaced significant populations and may be preserved in Middle Eastern flood myths. The drowning of coastal settlements had profound effects beyond just the physical displacement of people. These communities often possessed unique knowledge adapted to their specific environments. When a coastal settlement was flooded, its accumulated wisdom about local resources, weather patterns, seasonal changes, and survival strategies was lost unless it could be transmitted to the next generation in their new location. Some knowledge surely survived this transmission, but much must have been lost, representing an invisible cost of the rising seas. Consider specialized knowledge about tidal patterns, shellfish beds, migratory fish runs, or coastal plant resources. People who had spent generations learning the intricate details of a specific coastline had to abandon that expertise and learn entirely new patterns in unfamiliar territory. It would be like forcing a master farmer to become a hunter-gatherer, or vice versa possible, certainly, but representing a tremendous loss of specialized skill. The flooding also destroyed archaeological sites, making our understanding of this period frustratingly incomplete. The richest, most favorable locations for human settlement during the Ice Age river mouths, coastal plains, islands with abundant resources, are now underwater. Archaeologists can excavate inland sites from this period, but they're seeing only part of the picture. It is like trying to understand modern civilization by studying only mountain villages while ignoring coastal cities and river valleys. The most important sites are inaccessible, lying beneath hundreds of feet of water and thousands of years of marine sediment. Underwater archaeology has begun to address this gap, with researchers using sophisticated sonar, submarines, and diving techniques to explore drowned coastlines. They've discovered ancient settlements, stone tools, and even preserved footprints on what is now the seafloor. Each find provides precious glimpses into the lost world our ancestors inhabited. But underwater archaeology is expensive, technically challenging, and limited to relatively shallow depths. The deepest, oldest sites remain beyond our reach, keeping their secrets. The transformation of rivers during this period was equally dramatic as the flooding of coasts. As sea levels rose, the ocean pushed inland up river valleys, creating estuaries where none had existed before. Rivers that had flowed for hundreds of miles across exposed continental shelves, eventually reaching the distant sea, suddenly found the ocean at their doorstep. The portions of these river valleys that were above sea level became drowned landscapes, often preserved as underwater channels on modern continental shelves. These drowned river valleys represented critical losses of human habitat. River valleys were highways for travel and trade, sources of fresh water, magnets for game animals, and among the most productive locations for plant gathering. When they flooded, the human populations dependent on them had to either relocate entirely or adapt to living in the new estuarine environment that replaced the river valley. But again, humans showed remarkable flexibility. Many groups learned to exploit estuarine environments, which, despite the challenges, were extraordinarily productive. The mixing of fresh and salt water created unique ecosystems rich in fish, shellfish, waterfowl, and other resources. Communities that successfully adapted to estuarine life often thrived, developing sophisticated fishing technologies and intensive shellfish gathering practices. The massive shell middens found at ancient estuarine sites testify to thousands of years of sustained resource exploitation. The cultural impacts of the drowning landscapes extended beyond simple survival. Oral traditions and myths from cultures worldwide contain stories of great floods, of lands swallowed by water, of ancestors forced to flee rising seas. While we must be cautious about attributing specific myths to specific events, it is not unreasonable to think that some of these stories preserve cultural memories of the actual flooding that occurred at the end of the Ice Age. 7,000 to 10,000 years isn't that long in terms of oral tradition, roughly 300 to 400 generations. Stories can certainly persist that long, especially if they concern dramatic, life-changing events. The great flood myths found in Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Hindu, Greek, and many other traditions may reflect historical flooding events, though probably not a single global flood, but rather multiple regional catastrophes that were later combined and mythologized. The common elements in many of these stories: rising water destroying the known world, a few survivors preserving themselves and their knowledge, the eventual receding of the flood, and establishment of a new world, all parallel the actual experiences of people living through the end of the Ice Age. What is clear from both archaeological evidence and these cultural memories is that the drowning of ancient worlds was one of the defining experiences of early human history. It forced innovations in technology and social organization. It drove migrations that populated new territories. It created the world map we know today, with its current coastlines, islands, and seas. The world we inhabit is literally built on the drowned foundations of the world our ancestors knew. Understanding this flooding and how humans responded to it is crucial for understanding human history. But even more importantly, as we face our own period of climate change and rising seas, the experiences of our ancestors offer both warnings and lessons. They show us that humans can adapt to dramatic environmental changes, but also that such adaptation comes at tremendous cost. They demonstrate the importance of flexibility and innovation in the face of unstoppable environmental forces. And they remind us that the coastlines we know, the landscapes we inhabit, are not permanent features, but temporary snapshots in an ever-changing world. Chapter 3. Reading water like our ancestors. Stand at the edge of an unfamiliar river. The water moves past you, opaque and mysterious, hiding dangers and opportunities beneath its surface. To the untrained eye, it's just water flowing from somewhere to somewhere else. But to someone who knows how to read water the way our ancestors did, that river is a book full of information. The speed of the current, the patterns of ripples and eddies, the color and clarity, the sounds the water makes, the behavior of plants along the bank, the birds and insects hovering above the surface. All of these tell stories to those who know the language. For early humans navigating a flooded world, the ability to read water wasn't optional knowledge for specialists. It was fundamental survival literacy that everyone needed to master. Your life depended on understanding what water was telling you. A river that looked safe might hide deadly currents. A flooded area that appeared impassable might actually offer a walkable route if you knew how to spot the solid ground beneath the shallow water. An innocent-looking tidal flat could become a death trap when the tide turned. Learning to read water took years of patient observation, countless mistakes, hopefully non-fatal ones, and the accumulated wisdom passed down through generations. Let's start with the most basic skill: determining water depth. This might seem simple. Shallow water looks different from deep water, but appearances can be deceiving. Water clarity varies enormously depending on sediment load, algae content, and dissolved minerals. In some conditions, water 3 feet deep can appear as opaque as water 20 feet deep. In other conditions, you can see clearly to the bottom in water 10 feet deep. Our ancestors couldn't simply look at water and know its depth. They had to learn to read more subtle clues. The behavior of surface water provided crucial information. When water flows over a shallow obstruction like a sandbar or rocks, it creates distinctive ripple patterns. The spacing and characteristics of these ripples indicate the depth and nature of what lies below. Fast-moving water in shallow channels creates certain types of turbulence, while slow-moving water in deep channels behaves differently. By watching how water moved, experienced observers could mentally map the contours of the river or lake bottom without ever seeing it directly. Current speed was another critical factor to assess. A river with deceptively calm-looking surface might hide powerful currents just below. Understanding current required observing multiple indicators: the speed at which floating debris moved, the angle at which vegetation growing along the bank was bent by the flow, the sound the water made, and the patterns of foam or scum on the surface. Misjudging current strength could be fatal. Attempting to wade across a river with stronger current than anticipated could sweep you downstream, into deeper water or dangerous obstacles. Trying to paddle a raft or boat across current, too powerful for your strength, left you at the mercy of the river. Tides added another layer of complexity for coastal populations. If you've never experienced strong tides, it's hard to appreciate how dramatically they transform landscapes. Areas that are dry land at low tide become submerged channels at high tide. Tidal currents can be extraordinarily powerful, moving at speeds impossible to swim against. Tidal bores, waves that travel up rivers when the incoming tide meets the downstream flow, could overturn boats or sweep away people caught unaware. Learning to predict tides required understanding their relationship to the moon's phases. Early coastal peoples certainly knew this connection. It is not particularly difficult to observe that high and low tides correlate with the moon's position and phase. But beyond the basic pattern, tides vary with location, coastal geography, weather conditions, and seasonal factors. Becoming truly skilled at tide prediction required years of observation in a specific location. This knowledge was treasure passed from one generation to the next, often embedded in stories, songs, or seasonal markers that help people remember the complex patterns. The ability to identify safe water for drinking was crucial. Not all water is created equal. Saltwater or brackish water can't be safely consumed in quantity. Water contaminated with certain minerals, algae, or decaying organic matter can cause illness or death. Stagnant water might harbor parasites or diseases. Our ancestors had to learn to recognize the signs of safe water: clarity, taste, smell, the presence of certain plants or animals, the substrate the water flowed over, and the characteristics of the water source. Fresh water from rivers and streams was generally safer than stagnant water from ponds or marshes. But even rivers could be contaminated if something had died and decayed upstream. Water flowing over rocky bottoms was often cleaner than water flowing over mud. Springs bubbling up from underground were generally among the safest of sources. Rainwater collected in clean containers was excellent. Each region had its own patterns and peculiarities that people learned through experience. Reading weather patterns over water required different skills than reading weather over land. Water and land absorb and release heat differently, creating unique atmospheric conditions. Fog formed differently over water, often without the visual cues that preceded fog formation over land. Storms developed differently when moving over large bodies of water. Wind patterns over water were less predictable than over land because there were fewer obstacles to disrupt airflow. Coastal populations developed specialized knowledge about these water-influenced weather patterns. The behavior of animals provided crucial information about water conditions. Fish activity indicated water temperature, clarity, and the presence of food sources. Certain birds gathered where shellfish beds lay beneath shallow water. Other birds' presence or absence told you about water quality and safety. Mammals' behavior at water sources helped humans identify the safest places to drink. If deer regularly drank from a particular part of the river, it was probably safe for humans too. Plant life along waterways told stories about water patterns. Certain species grew only where fresh water was available year-round. Others indicated seasonal flooding patterns. The height and type of vegetation along riverbanks showed how high floods typically reached. In coastal areas, the line where salt-tolerant plants gave way to freshwater species marked the usual limits of tidal influence. Underwater plants indicated depth, bottom composition, and current speed. An area choked with certain aquatic plants might be too shallow for boat travel but perfect for wading. Another area with different plants might look similar from shore, but actually be dangerously deep. Understanding ice was critical for people living in regions where water froze seasonally. Ice thickness determined whether it was safe to walk on frozen rivers or lakes, crucial for winter travel in northern regions. But ice doesn't freeze uniformly. Torrent, depth, underwater springs, and other factors create variations in ice thickness, even on the same body of water. Rivers were especially treacherous because current kept some areas from freezing solidly, even when surrounding areas were frozen thick. People learned to test ice carefully, to recognize the visual and audible signs of weak ice, and to avoid areas where ice was likely to be dangerously thin. The spring ice breakup was particularly dangerous. As temperatures warmed, ice began to rot from the inside, even before it visibly weakened. Ice that looked solid might suddenly give way. When river ice finally broke, it created massive jams that could cause catastrophic flooding upstream and dangerous floating ice downstream. Communities living near rivers had to carefully monitor ice conditions during spring and be prepared to evacuate if ice jams threatened their settlements. Seasonal patterns in water levels govern many aspects of life for communities living near rivers or coasts. Rivers swelled with spring snowmelt and shrank during summer and fall. Knowing exactly when these changes would occur allowed people to time fishing expeditions, river crossings, and travel. Some rivers flooded their banks annually, creating cycles of inundation and exposure that people learned to exploit. The flood deposits left behind when waters receded created fertile soils perfect for certain plants. Fish and other aquatic animals often moved into flooded areas to spawn, creating predictable seasonal food sources. Navigation skills were critical for any travel over water. Without compasses or GPS, how did early peoples find their way across featureless expanses of water? They used multiple reference systems, the sun and stars for direction, prevailing winds and currents, the flight patterns of migrating birds, the presence of floating vegetation indicating proximity to shore, changes in watercolor suggesting depth changes, cloud formations that often formed over distant islands or mountains, and countless other subtle cues. Skilled navigators could guide boats across hundreds of miles of open water with remarkable accuracy. The sounds water made provided information that complemented visual observation. The roar of rapids warned of dangerous conditions ahead. The particular hiss and splash of waves breaking on a beach indicated the type of bottom sand made different sounds than rocks. Waterfalls created distinctive sounds that could be heard from miles away, serving as landmarks even in fog or darkness. The changing pitch of water sounds as tides rose and fell helped coastal peoples track tidal cycles without needing to constantly watch the water level. Touch and feel were equally important. The temperature of water told you about its source. Spring water stayed relatively constant in temperature, while surface water varied with air temperature. Current could be felt against your legs when wading, providing information about direction and strength. The substrate underfoot, mud, sand, gravel, or rock, was easier to feel than the sea in murky water, helping you navigate safely. All of this knowledge, visual, auditory, tactile, accumulated through observation and passed down through teaching, created a comprehensive literacy about water that modern people have largely lost. We've replaced this intimate, experiential knowledge with technology. Sonar tells us depth, GPS tells us location, tide tables tell us when the tide will turn, weather forecasts tell us about coming storms. These tools are powerful and useful, but they've also disconnected us from the direct experience of reading water. For early humans navigating the flooded world at the end of the Ice Age, developing this water literacy was essential. As coastlines changed, rivers transformed, and new bodies of water appeared where dry land had been. People had to continuously update their understanding. The knowledge accumulated by one generation about a specific coastline might be obsolete by the time their grandchildren were adults. This required not just memorizing specific facts about specific locations, but understanding the underlying principles that applied everywhere. The people who succeeded in this flooded world weren't those who knew one river or one coast perfectly. They were those who understood water itself, its behavior, its patterns, its dangers and opportunities. They could look at an unfamiliar body of water and read it like a familiar text, understanding what it was telling them and knowing how to respond. This deep literacy about water was one of the key innovations that allowed humans to thrive during one of history's most dramatic environmental transformations. Chapter 4: Boats, Rafts, and Floating Dreams pictured the moment when one's ancestors first deliberately floated across a body of water they couldn't wade. Perhaps they clung to a log that had fallen into a river. Perhaps they lashed together several logs and discovered they could stand on the improvised platform without sinking. Perhaps they noticed how hollow reeds floated and wondered if they could create something similar but larger. However it happened, this moment represents one of the most revolutionary innovations in human history: the discovery that humans could leave the land and travel on water. We don't know exactly when humans first built watercraft. Wood, reeds, animal skins, and other materials used for early boats rarely survive for archaeologists to find. The oldest confirmed boats are only about 10,000 years old, but humans almost certainly built boats much earlier than this. We know that people reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago, which required crossing substantial stretches of open water. We know that certain Mediterranean islands were occupied by humans more than 10,000 years ago, requiring boat travel. The direct evidence may be missing, but the indirect evidence is overwhelming. Humans have been building boats for tens of thousands of years. The simplest watercraft required minimal technology. A single log, if it was large enough, and the right type of wood, could support a person who straddled it and paddled with their hands. This wasn't a proper boat, more of a floating assist for swimming, but it extended the range humans could travel over water. With a good log, a strong swimmer could cross rivers too wide to swim unaided, or could travel along coastlines, resting on the log when tired. But individual logs had severe limitations. They rolled unpredictably, making balance precarious. They offered no way to keep supplies or children dry. They required constant physical effort to propel and steer. For water travel to become truly useful, humans needed to develop better solutions. The raft was probably the next development. By lashing multiple logs together with vines, roots, or cordage, people could create platforms that were much more stable than single logs. A raft made from 5 or 6 logs bundled side by side provided a reasonably flat platform that multiple people could stand or sit on. Supplies could be piled in the center, staying relatively dry even if the edges dipped into the water. Children, the elderly, or injured people could ride safely without needing swimming ability. Building an effective raft required several types of knowledge. First, you needed to know which types of wood floated best. Some woods are naturally more buoyant than others, depending on their density and structure. Trees growing near water often had characteristics that made them particularly suitable for raft building. They were already adapted to periodic flooding and tended to have wood that resisted waterlogging. Second, You needed cordage strong enough to withstand the stresses of water travel. Vines worked for short-term uses, but for rafts meant to last, processed cordage made from plant fibers or animal sinew was necessary. Third, you needed understanding of basic structural principles, how to arrange logs for maximum stability, how to lash them together so joints wouldn't work loose, how to distribute weight properly. Rafts had significant advantages. They were relatively simple to build with Stone Age tools. If they broke apart, the individual logs still floated, giving passengers a chance to survive. They could be very large. Some rafts built by later cultures could carry dozens of people plus cargo. But rafts also had serious limitations. They sat low in the water, so passengers and cargo got wet from waves and spray. They were slow and difficult to paddle or steer. They couldn't travel against significant current. And they were temporary. Most rafts would waterlog and lose buoyancy after weeks or months of use, requiring constant maintenance or eventual replacement. The next major innovation was the dugout canoe, which represented a quantum leap in watercraft technology. A dugout canoe was created by hollowing out a single large log, typically using a combination of stone tools and controlled fire. The process was labor-intensive and required considerable skill, but the result was a vessel far superior to any raft. The dugout sat higher in the water, keeping passengers and cargo dry. It was faster and more maneuverable. It could be paddled efficiently by 1 or 2 people. And if properly maintained, a dugout could last for years or even decades. Creating a dugout canoe was a major undertaking. First, you had to select the right tree large enough to hollow out a substantial vessel, but not so massive that working it was impossible. Certain species were preferred for their workability and durability. The tree had to be felled using stone axes, a process that might take several people many days. Then the log had to be transported to a work site, preferably near water, so the finished canoe could be easily launched. The actual hollowing process combined multiple techniques. Controlled burns could char the interior wood, making it softer and easier to scrape away with stone tools. But fire had to be carefully managed. Too much heat would burn through the hull. Too little would slow the work to a crawl. Experienced canoe builders could gauge the thickness of the remaining wood by feel and sound, knowing exactly how far they could hollow the interior before risking structural failure. The walls needed to be thin enough to keep the canoe light but thick enough to remain strong. Getting this balance right required years of practice and intimate knowledge of wood properties. The shape of the dugout was equally important. The bottom had to be carefully shaped to provide stability while still allowing efficient movement through water. The ends had to be properly designed to cut through waves without digging in or allowing water to splash inside. The width had to balance stability against speed. Wider canoes were more stable but harder to paddle, while narrower canoes were faster but more prone to tipping. Archaeological evidence shows that dugout canoes were being built in various parts of the world by at least 10,000 years ago, and probably much earlier. The Pest canoe from the Netherlands, dated to around 8000 BCE, is one of the oldest surviving examples. But the presence of dugouts in widely separated regions, from Europe to Southeast Asia to the Americas, suggests that the technology was invented independently multiple times, or was so ancient that it spread across the world before populations became isolated. The skin boat represented yet another technological approach. Instead of hollowing out a solid log, skin boats were built using a framework of wooden ribs and stringers, covered with animal hides that were sewn together and waterproofed with natural oils and resins. This construction method produced boats that were incredibly light relative to their carrying capacity. A skin boat that could carry several people and substantial cargo might weigh only 50 or 60 pounds, light enough for one person to carry over land when necessary. The most famous skin boats are the kayaks and umiaks of Arctic peoples, but similar vessels were built by cultures worldwide. The Welsh coracle, The Irish curragh, and various skin boats from Central Asia all use similar principles. These weren't primitive craft, but highly sophisticated designs optimized for specific environments and uses. Building a skin boat required different skills than building a dugout. The frame had to be carefully constructed to provide the right shape and strength while remaining light. The joints where ribs met stringers had to be precisely fitted and securely lashed. The skin covering had to be stretched tightly over the frame and sewn with stitches small and numerous enough that water couldn't leak through. The hides had to be treated to remain flexible in water while resisting rot. The advantages of skin boats were substantial. Their lightweight made them easy to portage around rapids or between waterways. They could be built in regions where trees large enough for dugouts weren't available. They could be designed with very specific performance characteristics: narrow and fast for hunters pursuing sea mammals, wide and stable for carrying families and cargo, shallow draft for navigating marshes and shallow rivers. Paddles evolved alongside boats, progressing from hands to crude clubs to sophisticated shaped implements. An efficient paddle had to have the right length for the paddler's arm span and the boat's height above the water. The blade had to be shaped to push water effectively without catching or creating excessive turbulence. The shaft had to be strong enough to withstand the forces of paddling, but light enough that it didn't cause exhaustion. Some cultures developed double-bladed paddles that allowed more efficient stroke patterns. Others created specialized paddles for different conditions: long, narrow blades for deep water, short, wide blades for shallow water or heavy loads. Sails represented an even more advanced technology that some cultures developed independently in different parts of the world. The simplest sails were probably just animal hides or woven mats held up to catch the wind, but effective sail technology required understanding wind behavior, knowing how to shape and position sails to capture wind efficiently, and developing rigging systems that could adjust sails to different wind conditions. Sailing allowed travel across vast distances with far less effort than paddling, opening up possibilities for long-distance trade, exploration, and migration. Navigation techniques evolved alongside boat technology. Early navigators used multiple reference systems to find their way across open water. The sun and stars provided directional guidance. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west, while certain stars remain relatively fixed in position. The North Star in the northern hemisphere provided a reliable reference point for determining direction at night. In the southern hemisphere, the Southern Cross constellation served a similar function. But celestial navigation alone wasn't enough for reliable travel. Cloud patterns often indicated the presence of land beyond the horizon. Clouds tend to form over islands and coastlines due to temperature differences between land and water. The color of water changed near shore as depth decreased, providing warning before you actually saw land. Floating vegetation, driftwood, and debris indicated proximity to rivers or shores. Seabirds' behavior offered clues. Some species always returned to land at night, so following them at dusk would lead you to shore. Experienced navigators learned to read currents and use them to their advantage. Ocean currents flow in predictable patterns, and understanding these patterns allowed travel over vast distances with minimal effort. The Kuroshio Current, flowing north along the coast of Japan, helped ancient mariners travel from Southeast Asia to the Japanese islands. The Atlantic's currents guided early peoples along the European coast and eventually across to the Americas. Wave patterns provided another navigation tool. Waves reflect off land masses, creating distinctive interference patterns that skilled navigators could detect. The Marshall Islanders of the Pacific developed stick charts that mapped these wave patterns, allowing navigation to islands that lay beyond the horizon. While we don't have evidence of such sophisticated techniques from the end of the Ice Age, the basic observations about wave behavior were certainly available to ancient navigators. The mental maps that early navigators maintained were remarkable. Without written records or physical maps, they had to memorize complex information about coastlines, currents, wind patterns, seasonal changes, and landmarks. A navigator might hold in their head detailed information about hundreds of miles of coastline, including every bay, headland, river mouth, and safe landing spot. This information was passed down through oral tradition, often encoded in songs, stories, or ritual chants that made the information easier to remember. Boat maintenance required constant attention. Dugout canoes needed periodic drying to prevent waterlogging and rot. Cracks had to be sealed with pitch or resin. Skin boats required regular treatment of the hides to keep them waterproof and flexible. Worn areas had to be patched before they leaked. Paddles broke and had to be replaced. The cordage used to lash rafts and bind boat components degraded and required renewal. A community that depended on water travel had to dedicate significant labor to maintaining their fleet. The social organization of boat travel created new patterns of cooperation. Large boats required coordinated paddling. Everyone had to stroke in rhythm to avoid wasting energy or causing the boat to veer off course. The person in the stern typically steered while those forward provided power. This required trust and communication. Long voyages demanded careful planning about food, water, and shelter. Someone had to have authority to make decisions about when to travel, when to seek shelter from storms, and where to land. The development of water transport technology was absolutely crucial for human adaptation to the flooded world of the late Ice Age. As coastlines moved, inland and river systems reorganized, the ability to travel by water became essential. Populations separated by new seaways could maintain contact through boat travel. Resources on islands or across rivers remained accessible. Trade networks could extend across bodies of water that would have been barriers without boats. Some of the most dramatic human migrations of this period were made possible by boats. The settlement of islands across the Pacific, the spread of people along coastlines, the crossing of river mouths and estuaries, all of these required watercraft. The colonization of Madagascar from Southeast Asia, a journey of thousands of miles across open ocean, was accomplished by people in boats not dramatically more sophisticated than those available to their Ice Age ancestors. The psychological shift that came with boat technology was equally profound. Humans were no longer bound to land. Water, which had been a barrier, became a highway. The rising seas that drowned ancient lands created new opportunities for those with the skills and technology to exploit them. Coastal waters teemed with fish, shellfish, seals, and seabirds, resources that could only be fully exploited with boats. Estuaries and river systems became networks for travel and trade rather than obstacles to overcome. The boat represented humanity's refusal to accept limits. When the world changed and land disappeared beneath the waves, we didn't simply retreat. We innovated. We learned to read water, to build craft that could carry us across it, to navigate by sun and stars and wave patterns. We turned catastrophe into opportunity, using the very waters that drowned our ancient worlds to build new paths across the earth. The floating dreams of our ancestors, their visions of traveling beyond the shore, of reaching distant lands, of mastering the element that covered most of Earth's surface, became reality through patience, innovation, and accumulated knowledge. The boats they built weren't just physical objects, but symbols of human adaptability and determination. They showed that no environmental change, no matter how dramatic, could defeat a species willing to learn, innovate, and persist. Chapter 5. Coastal Highways of the Flooded Earth. Imagine standing on a beach 15,000 years ago, looking out at an ocean that your great-grandparents would barely recognize. The shoreline has moved miles inland from where they knew it. Islands that were once hills on a coastal plain now stand isolated by channels of seawater. But you're not defeated by these changes. You've learned to use them. The same waters that swallowed ancient lands have created new pathways for travel and trade. The coast has become a highway, and you know how to navigate it. Coastlines, despite their constant transformation during the post-Ice Age flooding, offer unique advantages for human travel and settlement. Unlike inland travel, which required navigating around mountains, crossing rivers, and pushing through dense forests, coastal travel followed a natural corridor. The shore provided a reference line that made navigation simple. Keep the land on your left or right, and you couldn't get lost. Resources were abundant and predictable: shellfish, fish, seabirds, sea mammals, and edible seaweeds provided reliable food sources that didn't require the uncertainty of hunting land animals or the seasonal variation of plant gathering. The archaeological evidence for coastal migration routes during the late Ice Age is frustratingly sparse, but that's exactly what we'd expect. The coastlines that would have been most attractive to early humans are now underwater, buried beneath modern continental shelves. The richest archaeological sites from this period lie in waters 50 to 400 feet deep, covered by thousands of years of marine sediment. Despite this limitation, the evidence we do have from genetic studies, linguistic patterns, and the few accessible sites strongly suggests that coastal routes were major highways for human movement during this transformative period. The Kelp Highway hypothesis, proposed by researchers studying the peopling of the Americas, illustrates how coastal routes might have worked. This theory suggests that the first humans to enter the Americas traveled not through an ice-free corridor in the interior of the continent, but along the Pacific coast, using boats to travel from Asia through what is now Alaska and down the western coast of North and South America. The offshore kelp forests that grow in cold Pacific waters would have provided a ribbon of biological productivity stretching thousands of miles, offering consistent food sources for people traveling by boat. While this specific hypothesis remains debated, it demonstrates the kind of advantages coastal routes offered. Coastal travel didn't require long voyages across open water. Early mariners could practice island hopping, moving from one visible point to the next in a series of short hops rather than venturing far from land. Even with relatively primitive boats, traveling 10 or 20 miles per day along a coast was achievable. At this rate, people could travel hundreds of miles in a month, thousands of miles in a year. The distances that seem immense to us, traveling by foot through difficult terrain, became manageable when following coastal routes by boat. The rising seas that created such upheaval also created opportunities. As valleys flooded and became bays, they created new sheltered waters perfect for boat travel. Islands appeared as highlands were isolated from the mainland, creating stepping stones across regions that had been uniform coastal plains. Estuaries formed where rivers met the rising ocean, creating extraordinarily productive ecosystems that attracted both humans and their prey. In some ways, the flooded landscape was more navigable, not less, for people with boats and the skills to use them. Coastal settlements from this period show characteristic patterns. They tended to be located on elevated ground that wouldn't flood with storm surges or king tides, but close enough to the water for easy boat access. They favored locations near fresh water sources, streams or springs that provided drinking water. They clustered near especially productive fishing or shellfish gathering areas. And they were positioned to take advantage of natural harbors or protected beaches where boats could be safely landed. The seasonality of coastal resources created patterns of movement and settlement. Fish runs varied by season: salmon in the Pacific Northwest, herring in the Atlantic, mullet in the Gulf of Mexico. All follow predictable seasonal patterns. Shellfish were more available during certain tidal cycles. Seabirds nested in colonies at specific times of year, and their eggs provided rich seasonal food sources. Sea mammals like seals and whales followed migration patterns. Successful coastal peoples learned these rhythms and organized their lives around them. The accumulation of shell middens, massive deposits of discarded shells from thousands of meals, marks the locations of long-term coastal settlements. Some of these middens are enormous, representing centuries or even millennia of continuous occupation. They testify to the richness of coastal resources and the stability of coastal settlements. The shells themselves provide archaeologists with remarkable information. Different species of shellfish prefer different water conditions, so the species present in different layers of a midden reveal how water conditions changed over time as sea levels rose and coastal environments transformed. Trade networks developed along coastal routes, connecting communities separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles. Obsidian from volcanic sources in the Pacific Northwest has been found in sites hundreds of miles away. Shell ornaments from tropical waters have been discovered in temperate regions. Distinctive stone tools show up far from their manufacturing sites. These materials moved along coastal trade networks, passed from community to community in a chain of exchange that eventually stretched across continents. The exchange wasn't just of materials, but of knowledge. A fishing technique developed in one region could spread along the coast to other communities. Knowledge about boat building, about seasonal patterns in marine resources, about navigation techniques, all of this valuable information flowed along coastal networks. The coast became not just a physical highway, but an information highway, allowing innovations to spread rapidly across vast distances. Languages changed and diversified along coastal routes, but they also maintained connections. Linguistic studies show that languages along Pacific coastlines often share words related to marine resources, boat terminology, and navigation concepts. These shared vocabularies suggest long periods of contact and exchange along coastal routes. Even as communities developed distinct identities and cultures, their shared relationship with the ocean maintained links between them. The spiritual and cultural significance of the ocean grew as coastal peoples became more dependent on it. The ocean wasn't just a source of food and a travel route. It was a powerful, mysterious force that demanded respect and understanding. Many coastal cultures developed elaborate mythologies explaining the ocean's behavior, the creatures that lived in it, and humanity's relationship with it. Rituals and ceremonies honored the ocean and the resources it provided. Taboos governed behavior toward marine animals and plants, often serving conservation purposes by preventing overexploitation. The dangers of coastal life created selection pressure that favored certain skills and knowledge. People who couldn't learn to read weather patterns over water, who didn't develop strong swimming abilities, who couldn't master boat handling, these individuals were more likely to die in accidents. Over generations, coastal populations became increasingly skilled at oceanic life. Children grew up swimming, handling boats, and understanding tides from their earliest years. The accumulated knowledge and physical abilities of coastal peoples represented thousands of years of adaptation to marine environments. Storm surges and tsunamis represented special dangers for coastal communities. Storm surges, caused by severe weather systems pushing water toward shore, could raise sea levels 20 feet or more above normal high tide, inundating settlements and destroying boats. Tsunamis, generated by undersea earthquakes or landslides, created waves that could wipe out entire coastlines. The frequency of these events during the unstable climate of the late Ice Age would have been devastating for some communities. Yet coastal peoples learned to recognize the signs of approaching danger. Changes in animal behavior often preceded tsunamis: fish behaving strangely, birds fleeing inland, terrestrial animals seeking higher ground. The recession of water before a tsunami wave arrived provided crucial minutes of warning for those who understood its significance. The atmospheric conditions that spawned storm surges could be predicted by experienced weather watchers. Communities developed protocols for rapid evacuation to higher ground when danger threatened. The elevation of coastal settlements reflects this awareness of flood risks. Most successful long-term settlements were built on raised terraces or hills overlooking the water rather than right on the beach. This positioning provided safety from most storm surges, while still allowing easy water access. The exception settlements built right at water level were typically temporary camps for specific activities, like fishing expeditions or shellfish gathering, not permanent villages where the entire community lived. The relationship between coastal communities and inland populations varied. In some regions, clear distinctions developed between water people who lived exclusively coastal lives and land people who rarely ventured to the ocean. These groups might trade with each other, exchanging marine products for inland resources, but remained culturally distinct. In other regions, people maintained connections to both environments, spending part of the year on the coast exploiting marine resources and part of the year inland hunting and gathering terrestrial foods. The seasonal movements between coast and interior required maintaining knowledge about both environments. People had to remember the routes between coastal and inland camps. They needed to cache supplies at different locations to avoid carrying everything on seasonal migrations. They had to maintain relationships with other groups whose territories they passed through. This seasonal pattern of movement created complex territorial arrangements where multiple groups might use the same locations at different times of year. Coastal navigation extended beyond simple shoreline following. Experienced mariners learned to cut across bays rather than following every indentation of the coast, saving time and effort. They identified offshore islands that could serve as waypoints for more direct routes. They learned to read currents and use them for efficient travel. The development of these advanced navigation skills allowed exploitation of resources that would otherwise have been unreachable offshore fishing grounds, distant islands, and open water marine mammals. The boats used for coastal travel evolved to match the specific challenges of marine environments. They needed to handle waves and swells that didn't exist on rivers and lakes. They required greater buoyancy to remain safe in rough water. They benefited from higher sides to keep out spray and waves. Coastal boats were typically larger and sturdier than river craft, though this made them heavier and less portable. The marine mammal hunting that some coastal peoples practiced required specialized boats and techniques. Seals, sea lions, and whales were formidable prey that could easily destroy boats or kill hunters. Pursuing them required fast, maneuverable craft and weapons designed for marine hunting. The success of marine mammal hunting cultures, like the Inuit of the Arctic, whose ancestors developed these skills thousands of years ago, demonstrates the sophistication possible in coastal adaptations. The preservation of fish and shellfish for long-term storage was crucial for coastal peoples living in seasonal environments. Fish could be dried, smoked, or salted to preserve it for months. Shellfish could be dried or processed into a concentrated food product. These preservation techniques allowed coastal communities to build up food stores that sustained them through unproductive seasons or provided trade goods for exchange with inland groups. The coastal highways of the flooded earth weren't just routes for travel but corridors for the development and spread of human culture. As people moved along these routes, they carried with them technologies, languages, genetic diversity, and cultural practices. The coasts became laboratories of innovation where people developed new ways of living that would eventually spread across the world. The challenge of adapting to a flooding, changing coastline drove innovations in boat building, navigation, resource exploitation, and social organization that benefited all of humanity. Today, as we face our own period of rising seas due to climate change, the experiences of our coastal ancestors offer both warnings and inspiration. They show us that humans can adapt to dramatic coastal changes, but also that such adaptation requires flexibility, innovation, and accumulated knowledge. The coastal highways they pioneered connected continents and spread cultures. The paths they built across the flooded earth became the foundation for much of human civilization. Their story reminds us that coastlines are not permanent features, but dynamic zones of change where human creativity and resilience are constantly tested and proven. Chapter 6. River roads through changing lands. Rivers have always been humanity's natural highways, flowing corridors through otherwise difficult terrain. But during the end of the Ice Age, rivers underwent transformations as dramatic as the coastlines. As glaciers melted and sea levels rose, rivers that had flowed for hundreds of miles across exposed continental shelves found the ocean suddenly at their doorsteps. Their lower reaches flooded, creating estuaries. Their flow patterns changed as base levels rose. New tributaries formed as meltwater carved fresh channels. The river roads that had guided human travel for millennia were being redrawn, and people had to learn to navigate them anew. The geography of rivers during the Ice Age was radically different from today. With sea levels 400 feet lower, many modern rivers extended far beyond their current mouths, flowing across what is now continental shelf. The Thames, Rhine, and Seine in Europe merged into a single system flowing across the dry North Sea basin. The Amazon extended hundreds of miles beyond its current mouth, flowing through what is now submerged continental shelf. The Mississippi carried water across a broad coastal plain to reach an ocean shore that lay far south of today's Louisiana coast. These extended river systems created natural corridors for human movement. People could follow a river for thousands of miles, traveling from deep inland to distant coasts without leaving the water-rich environment that provided food, drinking water, and relatively easy travel. The loss of these extended systems as they flooded forced major adjustments in how people traveled and where they settled. The transformation of river mouths into estuaries created some of the most productive environments on Earth. An estuary, where fresh water from rivers mixes with salt water from the ocean, supports extraordinary biological diversity. The mixing waters create unique chemical conditions that promote the growth of aquatic plants, which support immense populations of fish, crustaceans, and birds. For human populations, estuaries were paradise food so abundant that simply wading into the water with a basket could yield a meal. The Chesapeake Bay in North America illustrates this transformation. During the Ice Age, the Susquehanna River flowed across a broad coastal plain, carrying water from the Appalachian Mountains to an ocean shore far beyond the current bay. As sea levels rose, the lower valley of the Susquehanna flooded, creating the Chesapeake Bay, a vast estuary that became one of North America's richest ecosystems. Native American populations thrived around the bay for thousands of years, exploiting oysters, crabs, fish, and waterfowl that flourished in the estuarine environment. But the creation of estuaries also disrupted established travel routes. A river that could be easily forded or crossed by raft during low water became a broad estuary with strong tidal currents, waves, and depths that made crossing dangerous or impossible without substantial boats. Communities that had been connected by easy river crossings found themselves separated by water barriers. The adjustments required went far beyond simply learning new crossing points. Entire patterns of movement, trade, and social connection had to be reorganized. Upstream from the estuaries, rivers themselves were changing. The rising base level caused by higher sea levels meant that river gradients decreased. Where rivers had once flowed swiftly through relatively narrow channels, they now meandered more slowly through broader floodplains. Some rivers split into multiple channels, creating complex braided systems that shifted course unpredictably. Others deepened their channels but flooded their banks more frequently as the change gradient affected flow dynamics. These hydrological changes affected every aspect of riverine life. Fish migration patterns changed as new obstacles appeared or old ones disappeared. Seasonal flooding patterns shifted. The vegetation along riverbanks transformed as different water regimes favored different plant communities. Communities that had developed detailed knowledge about a specific river over many generations watched that knowledge become obsolete as the river itself changed character. Yet people adapted. They learned the new patterns. They found new crossing points. They developed new fishing techniques suited to change conditions. They moved their settlements to locations less vulnerable to the altered flooding regimes. The flexibility and resilience that had allowed humans to survive the initial flooding served them equally well as rivers continued to evolve. River travel technology evolved to match changing conditions. Where rapids and shallow sections had once made boat travel difficult on upper river reaches, the rising base levels sometimes made these same sections more navigable. Conversely, lower reaches that had been easily navigable might become choked with tidal influence, requiring boats that could handle both river current and tidal flow. The boats themselves had to be versatile, capable of being paddled upstream, steered through current, and maneuvered in tidal waters. The development of portage routes became crucial. When rivers became impassable due to rapids, waterfalls, or other obstacles, people established portage trails where boats and cargo could be carried over land to navigable water beyond the obstacle. These portage routes, once established, were used for generations or even millennia. Some modern hiking trails in North America and Europe follow ancient portage routes that were first used by Ice Age peoples navigating changing river systems. The knowledge required to successfully navigate rivers was extensive and detailed. You needed to know where the deep channels ran, crucial for boats but not obvious from the surface. You had to recognize the signs of underwater obstacles like submerged logs or rocks. You needed to understand how current behaved around bends, where it was strongest, where it created dangerous eddies. You had to know where to beach boats safely, where the banks were stable enough without getting stuck in mud. Seasonal variations in river conditions added another layer of complexity. Spring snowmelt swelled rivers to many times their summer volume, creating entirely different conditions. Some rivers flooded their banks so extensively that the usual channel disappeared into a broad sheet of water covering the floodplain. Summer drought could reduce mighty rivers to strings of isolated pools. Fall rains brought a second flood pulse, less dramatic than spring, but still significant. Winter freeze-up in northern regions created yet another set of conditions where rivers became highways of ice rather than water. The biological productivity of rivers varied seasonally in ways that governed human activity. Salmon runs in rivers draining to the Pacific provided spectacular seasonal abundance. Thousands of fish swimming upstream to spawn, easily caught in vast numbers during the weeks or months of the run. Other fish species had their own migration patterns. Waterfowl use rivers as migration corridors, stopping at wetlands and backwaters to rest and feed. Knowing these patterns and timing your activities to exploit them was essential for successful riverine life. River systems served as more than transportation routes. They were communication networks connecting distant populations. A piece of news, a technological innovation, or a new idea could travel hundreds of miles along a river system in a matter of weeks as different groups encountered each other at fishing spots, trading locations, or shared hunting grounds. The rivers tied together populations that might otherwise have remained isolated, creating cultural continuities across vast distances. The spiritual significance of rivers deepened during this period of transformation. Rivers were sources of life. They provided water, food, and travel routes. But they were also dangerous and unpredictable, capable of flooding devastatingly or drying up completely. Many cultures developed elaborate mythologies explaining rivers' origins and behaviors. Rivers were often personified as spirits or deities that had to be honored and respected. Offerings might be made to river spirits before dangerous journeys or to give thanks for safe passage. The transformation of specific rivers could be preserved in cultural memory through oral traditions. Stories of ancestors who knew the river when it flowed differently, when crossings existed where now there was only deep water, when fish were more or less abundant. These narratives encoded historical information about environmental change. While we must be cautious about interpreting such stories literally, they likely contain kernels of accurate observation passed down through generations. The meeting of river and ocean in newly formed estuaries created complex environments that required understanding both freshwater and marine systems. The tidal influence pushed salt water upstream twice daily, creating zones where water transitioned from fresh to brackish to salt over the course of a tidal cycle. Fish, shellfish, and plants responded to these changing conditions. People had to learn entirely new patterns of resource distribution and availability. Estuarine fishing required different techniques than either river or ocean fishing. The changing salinity and tidal currents meant that fish behavior was less predictable than purely fresh or salt water. But the reward for mastering estuarine fishing was substantial. Estuaries supported incredible fish populations, and multiple species could be caught from the same location by adjusting techniques for different tidal stages. The flood pulses that occurred when glacial lakes catastrophically drained downstream would have been devastating for any human communities in their paths. Walls of water higher than houses, moving faster than anyone could run, swept down river valleys with such force that they rearranged the landscape. Boulder fields, carved channels, and eroded valleys marked the paths of these ancient floods. Any settlements, any people caught in these catastrophes would have been obliterated. The survivors would carry traumatic memories of the destruction, memories that might be preserved in flood myths and stories of waters that destroyed the world. The establishment of permanent or semi-permanent settlements along rivers required careful site selection. The location had to provide access to river resources and transportation while offering protection from flooding. It needed fresh water, but couldn't be so low that it was vulnerable to storm surges in estuarine areas or spring floods in upper reaches. It required defensible positions if human conflict was a concern. Finding sites that met all these criteria became increasingly challenging as rivers transformed. Trade goods moved along rivers in predictable patterns. Heavy or bulky items could be transported by boat far more easily than by land. A dugout canoe could carry hundreds of pounds of cargo that would require multiple people to transport overland. This made rivers crucial for trade networks. Resources from inland areas moved downriver to coastal populations. Marine products moved upriver to interior communities. The river became an economic lifeline connecting diverse populations. The control of strategic river locations, major fording points, portages, especially productive fishing spots, sometimes became sources of conflict. As populations grew and resources became more valuable, groups competed for access to the best locations. Some communities may have attempted to control river travel through their territories, demanding tribute or trade goods from those passing through. The archaeology of conflict increases during this period in some regions, possibly reflecting these territorial disputes. The technology for river crossing evolved alongside other water transport innovations. Where wading or raft crossing had been sufficient, deeper waters required better boats. Fixed crossing points might be improved with landing areas cleared on both banks, paths marked to the water's edge, and even simple piers or platforms built to make boat launching easier. Communities located at major crossing points gained economic advantages from providing crossing services to travelers. The seasonal movements of human populations often followed river corridors. Summer camps might be located on smaller tributary streams where fishing was good and water was plentiful. Winter camps might be on major rivers where protection from wind was better and wood for fuel was more available. Spring movements might target specific locations for seasonal fish runs. These patterns created a rhythm of life tied to the river's annual cycle. The knowledge systems required for successful riverine life were passed down through apprenticeship and storytelling. Children learned by accompanying adults on fishing expeditions, by helping with boat maintenance, by listening to stories about dangerous situations and how to avoid them. This knowledge was too complex and nuanced to be transmitted through brief instruction. It required years of observation and practice to master. The river's roads through changing lands were paths of adaptation and innovation. As these ancient highways transformed, people transformed with them. They developed new technologies, new knowledge systems, new ways of organizing their lives around flowing water. The challenges were immense, but so were the opportunities. The rivers, even in their changed forms, remained highways connecting distant places, bringing together diverse peoples, and supporting human communities through one of history's most dramatic environmental transformations. Chapter 7. Island hopping across vanished bridges. The land bridge was dying. For thousands of years, it had connected two continents, allowing humans and animals to walk freely between them. But now, with each passing generation, the crossing grew more difficult. What had been dry ground became marshy. Streams became rivers. Rivers became channels of seawater. Eventually, only islands remained, scattered across a shallow sea where solid land had once stood. This was the end of Beringia, the land bridge between Asia and North America. And similar scenes played out across the world as rising seas transformed connected landmasses into archipelagos. Beringia is the most famous of the drowned land bridges, but it wasn't alone. Between Southeast Asia and Australia, a complex landscape called Sahul provided routes for human migration before flooding isolated Australia. Between Britain and continental Europe, the North Sea basin was dry land crossed by rivers and inhabited by human communities. Between Japan and the Asian mainland, shallow seas were once passable plains. Across the Mediterranean, various land connections existed during periods of lower sea level. The world map at the end of the Ice Age was radically different from what we know today, with many areas now separated by water having been connected by land. The transformation of land bridges into island chains was gradual but inexorable. Picture a low-lying plain during the early stages of flooding. At first, the changes are barely noticeable. The lowest areas become seasonal wetlands, marshy during wet periods, but still passable during dry seasons. Streams that were easily forded become rivers that require rafts or boats to cross. As sea levels continue rising, the lowest areas become permanent lagoons, then bays, then open seawater. The highest points remain as islands, at first large and connected at low tide, but eventually isolated by channels too deep and wide to ford. For the human populations living through this transformation, the impact must have been profound. Your grandparents walked freely to territories that you can now reach only by boat. Stories passed down through generations describe a unified land where now there are scattered islands. The mental maps that guided previous generations are obsolete, requiring constant updating as the geography literally changes beneath your feet. Yet humans adapted to these changes through a strategy archaeologists call island hopping, rather than viewing the flooded regions as barriers. People learned to use the newly created islands as stepping stones. With adequate boats and navigation skills, you could move from island to island, never venturing too far from land, crossing gaps that would have been impossible to swim but were manageable with watercraft. This strategy allowed people to maintain connections across regions that were becoming increasingly fragmented by rising seas. The settlement of the Pacific Islands demonstrates the power of island hopping strategies. Though this occurred much later than the end of the Ice Age flooding, the Polynesian expansion across the Pacific, reaching islands separated by thousands of miles of open ocean, represents the ultimate refinement of island hopping techniques. But the roots of these skills likely stretch back to the period when rising seas first forced people to adapt to increasingly fragmented landscapes. The technology required for successful island hopping went beyond simple boat building. Navigators needed to maintain mental maps of island locations, currents, wind patterns, and seasonal variations. They needed to identify which islands had fresh water, sources crucial for survival on small islands lacking streams or springs. They needed to know which islands provided safe harbors where boats could be landed and launched even in rough weather conditions. They had to understand which islands offered food resources and which were barren rocks that couldn't support human life. The distance between islands determined the level of technology and skill required. Islands separated by just a few miles could be reached with relatively simple craft and basic navigation skills. As distances increased, more sophisticated boats and navigation techniques became necessary. Crossing channels 10 or 20 miles wide required boats sturdy enough to handle open water conditions. Navigators skilled enough to maintain course despite currents and winds, and the physical endurance to paddle or sail for hours without rest. The psychological challenge of island hopping shouldn't be underestimated. Launching into open water, knowing that if something goes wrong, if your boat springs a leak, if the weather turns bad, if you become disoriented, there's nowhere to go except down, requires remarkable courage. The first people to make these crossings faced not just physical danger, but the terror of venturing into unknown waters with uncertain destinations. Each successful crossing built confidence, but each also reinforced awareness of how easily things could go wrong. Some islands in newly formed archipelagos became hub locations larger, islands with better resources that served as bases for exploring and exploiting surrounding smaller islands. People might maintain permanent settlements on these hub islands, while making day trips or seasonal expeditions to smaller islands for specific purposes like hunting seabirds, gathering eggs, or hunting sea mammals that hauled out on remote beaches. This hub-and-spoke pattern of settlement appears in archaeological records from various island systems worldwide. The biological resources of newly created islands varied dramatically depending on their size, topography, and isolation. Larger islands that had been hilltops on the former plain retained diverse ecosystems with multiple plant and animal species. Smaller islands might have very limited resources, perhaps a few species of grass, some seabirds, and whatever marine resources could be gathered from the surrounding waters. The smallest islands were essentially uninhabitable, useful only as temporary stopping points during longer voyages. The isolation of animal populations on newly created islands led to interesting evolutionary developments. Animals stranded on islands when sea levels rose either adapted to the new conditions or went extinct. Some species survived on islands long after they disappeared from mainland populations. The famous megafauna extinctions that occurred at the end of the Ice Age followed different timelines on islands versus continents. Mammoths, for instance, survived on isolated Arctic islands thousands of years after their mainland relatives disappeared, protected by their isolation from the hunting pressure and climate changes that decimated continental populations. For humans, these relic populations of Ice Age animals on isolated islands sometimes provided important food sources. An island that retained populations of animals extinct elsewhere could support human communities long after those animals had vanished from the mainland. But the small size of island ecosystems made them vulnerable to overexploitation. Hunting pressure that continental ecosystems could absorb might devastate an island population. Many island species went extinct shortly after human arrival, suggesting that overhunting or ecosystem disruption caused their demise. The cultural diversity that developed across island chains reflected the isolation that water barriers created. While islands close together might maintain regular contact and shared cultural practices, more distant islands developed increasingly distinct traditions. Languages diverged as populations were separated by water barriers that limited communication. Art styles, tool technologies, and social practices evolved independently on different islands. The archaeological record shows this cultural diversification. Clearly, artifacts from closely spaced islands show similarities, while those from more distant islands in the same chain become increasingly distinct. Yet trade networks maintain some connections across even widely separated islands. Valuable materials like obsidian, specialized tools, shell ornaments, and other goods move between islands through exchange networks. A valuable item might pass through multiple intermediate communities, moving from island to island in a chain of exchanges that eventually connected communities that had no direct contact with each other. These trade networks served social and political functions beyond simple material exchange, maintaining relationships and alliances across fragmented populations. The navigation techniques required for island hopping became increasingly sophisticated as the distances between islands grew. Early navigators developed remarkable systems for wayfinding across open water. They learned to read wave patterns swells reflect off islands, creating distinctive interference patterns that skilled navigators could detect even when the island itself was beyond visual range. They studied the behavior of birds. Some species always returned to land at night, so following them at dusk would lead to shore. They observed clouds. Certain types tended to form over islands due to rising warm air, making distant islands visible as cloud formations before the land itself appeared over the horizon. The stars provided crucial navigation guidance for night travel. The constellations' apparent rotation around the celestial poles gave directional information. Certain stars rose and set at predictable points on the horizon, providing directional references. The path of the sun during the day similarly indicated east and west. But using these celestial references required clear skies cloudy. Conditions could leave navigators disoriented, with no reliable way to determine direction. Seasonal timing of voyages became critical for success. Some times of year offered more favorable weather conditions, calmer seas, and more predictable winds than others. Experienced island communities learned to time their voyages for optimal conditions, waiting for seasonal windows when crossing was safest. This meant that contact between islands might be regular during favorable seasons, but completely absent during dangerous periods. The loss of land bridges had profound effects on human population, genetics, and cultural development. Populations that had been unified when land connections existed became isolated as rising seas created barriers. Over time, this isolation led to genetic divergence. Populations on different sides of new water barriers accumulated different genetic mutations and lost shared variations through genetic drift. The genetic signatures of these ancient separations can still be detected in modern populations, providing clues about when and where rising seas divided previously unified groups. Some populations successfully maintained contact across water barriers and continued to exchange genes and cultural practices even after land bridges flooded. These groups developed the maritime technologies and skills necessary to make regular crossings. Other populations became isolated, with little or no contact across the water barriers that separated them. The different trajectories of these populations maintaining contact versus isolation shaped the subsequent history of human cultures in profound ways. The psychological and cultural significance of drowned lands appears in the mythologies of many cultures. Stories of lost lands, of paradises that sank beneath the waves, of ancestors who lived in places that no longer exist. These narratives appear worldwide. While we must be cautious about interpreting mythology as literal history, it's plausible that some of these stories preserve cultural memories of the actual flooding that occurred at the end of the Ice Age. The Greek myth of Atlantis, though elaborated and mythologized beyond any possible historical basis, might have roots in cultural memories of Mediterranean lands flooded by rising seas. The Aboriginal Australian stories of the flooding of lands connecting Australia to Tasmania may preserve genuine historical information about the flooding of Bass Strait. The legends of sunken lands off the coasts of Wales and France could reflect memories of the flooding of land that's now beneath the Celtic Sea and English Channel. The visibility of lost lands would have reinforced these memories. In clear water, especially at low tide, the remains of flooded forests, the outlines of former river valleys, and other evidence of drowned landscapes would have been visible from boats. Fishermen would regularly encounter the remains of former terrestrial environments, tree stumps rooted in what is now seafloor, deposits of peat and soil in places covered by water, the bones of land animals in deposits beneath the sea. These tangible reminders that the land had once extended farther would have kept alive the memory of the flooding. The adaptation to island life required more than just developing boats and navigation skills. Island communities had to organize their societies differently than mainland populations. The limited resources of islands meant that populations had to carefully manage their numbers relative to available food and water. Birth spacing, temporary immigration during hard times, or other population control mechanisms became necessary on islands where unchecked growth would lead to resource depletion and starvation. The social structures of island communities often reflected their isolation and self-sufficiency. With limited ability to call on outside assistance during crises, island populations needed to be resilient and resourceful. They developed extensive knowledge about their local environments, learning to exploit every available resource efficiently. They maintained larger toolkits than mainland populations might need, ensuring they could handle diverse challenges with local resources. They passed knowledge between generations with particular care, knowing that lost information couldn't easily be replaced from outside sources. The defense of island territories took on special characteristics. While mainland communities might face threats from multiple directions, islands had natural barriers that channeled any attackers through predictable routes. The beaches and harbors where boats could land. This made defense potentially easier, as limited landing sites could be watched and defended. However, it also made islands vulnerable to blockade or siege, as cutting off outside access could quickly starve an island population that couldn't escape. The comparison between communities that successfully adapted to island hopping and those that didn't reveals important factors in human resilience. Groups that maintain maritime skills, that pass navigation knowledge reliably between generations, that built appropriate boats and kept them maintained. These communities thrived in the new island environments. Groups that failed to develop or maintain these skills found themselves increasingly isolated, cut off from trade networks and marriage exchanges that had previously connected them to larger populations. Some isolated communities persisted for generations before eventually disappearing, victims of inbreeding, resource depletion, or simple bad luck, epidemic, a destructive storm, or a failed harvest at a larger, connected community could have survived. The archaeological study of ancient island hopping faces significant challenges. The most important sites, the islands that served as stepping stones across now flooded land bridges, are typically underwater, their archaeological remains buried beneath marine sediments. The boats used for island hopping were made from organic materials that rarely survive in archaeological contexts. Much of what we know must be inferred from indirect evidence, genetic patterns, suggesting when populations separated or maintained contact, linguistic relationships indicating cultural connections, and the few surviving artifacts that hint at maritime capabilities. Despite these challenges, the evidence clearly shows that humans successfully adapted to the transformation of land bridges into island chains. They developed the technologies, skills, and social organizations necessary to maintain connections across increasingly fragmented landscapes. They turned barriers into pathways, using boats and navigation skills to hop from island to island across regions that had once been traversed on foot. The rising seas that drowned the land bridges didn't isolate human populations. Instead, they drove the innovations in maritime technology and navigation that would eventually allow humans to reach every habitable island on Earth. The vanished bridges forced humanity to become a maritime species. The loss of easy land connections made us develop the skills to cross water barriers. The fragmentation of populations drove innovations in boat building, navigation, and social organization. What seemed like catastrophic losses, the drowning of vast territories, the severing of long-standing connections, became opportunities for adaptation and expansion. The island hoppers of the late Ice Age built pathways across the flooded remnants of ancient land bridges, and in doing so, they built the foundation for humanity's eventual colonization of the entire planet. Chapter 8. Settlements on shifting shores. You wake to find the marker stone half submerged. Your grandfather placed that stone at the high tide line when he was young, recording the limit of the ocean's reach. Now it stands in water even at low tide. The beach where children played has narrowed to a thin strip. The forest that once stood 50 paces from the water has surrendered its front line to the waves. Dead trees stand like ghosts in the surf, their roots exposed by the eroding shore. This is your fourth lifetime witnessing the ocean's advance. Your great-grandmother remembered when the shore was a full day's walk beyond its present location. You wonder where your great-grandchildren will live, and whether the ocean will ever stop its relentless march inland. This was the reality for countless communities living through the post-Ice Age sea level rise. Building permanent settlements on coasts that were constantly changing required a fundamentally different approach than settlement in stable environments. The challenge wasn't just adapting to change. It was creating stable communities and cultural continuity despite knowing that your settlement location would eventually become uninhabitable. How do you build a home when you know the ocean will eventually claim it? The archaeological record shows that coastal communities developed several strategies for dealing with rising seas. The most common was serial relocation, building a settlement, occupying it for 1 to 3 generations, then abandoning it as water encroached and building a new one slightly inland. Sites along ancient coastlines often show this pattern. Multiple occupation layers at progressively higher elevations, each representing a different generation settlement as they retreated before the advancing ocean. This strategy of planned obsolescence required a particular mindset. You didn't build for permanence, but for functionality. Shelters were substantial enough to last a generation, but not built with the expectation that your grandchildren would occupy them. You invested in portable goods, tools, ornaments, knowledge rather than fixed improvements to land that would soon be underwater. Your attachment was to your community and culture, not to specific plots of ground. The material culture of these communities reflects this mobility. Archaeological sites show evidence of well-made tools and carefully crafted portable items, but relatively little investment in permanent structures or landscape modifications. Storage pits are shallow and temporary. Hearths are simple rather than elaborately constructed. Houses are built from readily available materials using techniques that could be easily replicated in a new location. Everything about the settlement design suggests people who expected to move. Yet within this framework of impermanence, communities maintained remarkable continuity. Oral traditions preserve knowledge about resource locations, seasonal patterns, and social relationships. Craft techniques were passed from generation to generation. Ritual practices and spiritual beliefs provided cultural anchor points that remained constant even as physical locations changed. The community persisted even though its physical home kept shifting. Some communities adopted different strategies, attempting to protect their settlements from rising waters through engineering. Raised platforms or mounds could keep living areas above flood levels, at least temporarily. Drainage channels might redirect water around vulnerable areas. Protective barriers of stone or wood could reduce erosion from waves. While primitive by modern standards, these efforts show that people weren't simply passive victims of rising seas, but actively worked to maintain their chosen locations. The success of these protective efforts varied. Small-scale interventions might delay the inevitable for a generation, allowing communities to remain in preferred locations longer. But ultimately, the scale of sea level rise overwhelmed any barriers that Stone Age technology could construct. A rise of several feet per century couldn't be stopped with earthen mounds or wooden palisades. Eventually, every coastal settlement either relocated or was abandoned. The decision of when to move was complex and probably contentious. Conservative members of communities might resist abandoning familiar locations, arguing that the ocean's advance would slow or stop. More forward-thinking individuals might push for early relocation before conditions became desperate. Different families within a community might make different choices, with some leaving early to establish new settlements while others remained in the old location as long as possible. These divisions could fracture communities, splitting unified groups into multiple smaller populations. The process of relocation itself was a major undertaking. Suitable new locations had to be scouted and evaluated. Did they have fresh water? Were food resources adequate? Was the terrain defensible? Would the new location itself be vulnerable to future flooding, or was it high enough to provide long-term security? Once a location was chosen, new shelters had to be built, often while maintaining the old settlement. Supplies had to be transported. The entire infrastructure of daily life had to be reconstructed in the new location. For communities making these moves, the transition period when both old and new settlements were occupied was probably common. People might maintain homes in both locations, spending time in the old settlement while it was still viable, but gradually shifting more activity to the new site. This transition strategy spread the labor burden over time and provided insurance against problems with the new location. If the new settlement proved unsuitable, the old one could still serve as a backup until alternatives were found. The elevation of new settlements reflected growing understanding of flood risks. Early settlements during periods of relatively stable sea levels might be located right at the water's edge for easy access to marine resources. But as rising seas repeatedly forced relocations, communities learned to build higher. Late-period settlements show a clear preference for elevated locations on bluffs or terraces overlooking the water. These positions sacrificed some. Convenience residents had to travel farther to access the shore but provided security against flooding and storm surges. The timing of relocations often coincided with other events that naturally divided the community's life into distinct periods. A settlement might be abandoned when a respected elder died, with the move framed as part of the mourning process. Or a community might relocate after a successful season when food stores were full and labor was available for building. Connecting the practical necessity of relocation to culturally meaningful events helped communities process the disruption and maintain a sense of continuity. The ruins of abandoned settlements served as landmarks and memory places. When visiting the area where their ancestors have lived, people would find the remains of hearths, broken tools, and other evidence of past occupation. These physical remnants connected present communities to their history. Stories about life in the abandoned settlements were told and retold, keeping alive the memory of places that no longer existed above water. Some communities might revisit old settlement sites periodically, perhaps performing rituals, honoring ancestors who had lived there. The psychological toll of serial relocation shouldn't be underestimated. Modern disaster research shows that forced displacement from homes creates lasting trauma. Even when the displacement is anticipated rather than sudden, losing one's home creates stress, grief, and anxiety. For communities repeatedly displaced by rising seas, these psychological burdens accumulated across generations. The constant low-level stress of living in an impermanent home, knowing that relocation was inevitable, must have affected mental health and social cohesion. Yet humans are remarkably resilient, and these communities found ways to maintain psychological well-being despite constant displacement. The rituals and ceremonies that marked relocations probably served therapeutic functions, helping people process loss and embrace new beginnings. The emphasis on portable culture and relationships rather than fixed locations may have protected psychological health by reducing attachment to places destined to be lost. The shared experience of displacement created community bonds. Everyone was in the same situation, facing the same challenges. The children born into these communities grew up knowing that change was constant. Unlike their great-grandparents, who had lived in a seemingly stable world before rapid sea level rise began, these children never knew geographic permanence. To them, the ocean's advance and the need to periodically relocate were simply normal features of life. This generational difference in perspective probably created tensions, elders mourning the lost world of their youth while young. People adapted to change as the only reality they'd ever known. The settlements that survived long-term were those located on high ground well above the reach of rising seas. Some communities were fortunate enough to occupy locations that remained safe even as waters rose hundreds of feet. These became refuges, attracting populations displaced from lower elevations. The archaeological record from such sites often shows sudden population increases and the appearance of new cultural elements, suggesting the arrival of displaced peoples, bringing their traditions to merge with existing communities. The integration of displaced populations into established communities created both opportunities and challenges. The newcomers brought knowledge, technologies, and genes that enriched the host communities. But they also brought competition for resources and potential social conflicts. How these encounters played out determined whether the communities thrived through diversity or fragmented through conflict. Successful integration required tolerance, flexibility, and willingness to share resources and space. The linguistic effects of population, movements, and relocations can still be detected in modern language distributions. Languages spoken in coastal regions often show evidence of past movements. Loan words from languages that were spoken by now vanished coastal populations. Grammatical structures suggesting contact between groups that are now separated by water. And patterns of linguistic diversity that make sense only in light of ancient population movements driven by rising seas. Architectural styles that developed in coastal communities reflected both the impermanence of individual settlements and the continuity of cultural traditions. Certain building designs, material choices, and spatial arrangements persisted across multiple relocations, maintaining cultural identity even as physical locations changed. A visitor might recognize a community's settlements across different sites and time periods by their characteristic architectural features. Even though the specific structures were different, the sacred sites and ritual locations of coastal communities faced particular challenges from rising seas. A location that had spiritual significance, perhaps, where important ceremonies were performed or where ancestors were buried, might be threatened by flooding. Communities had to make difficult decisions, attempt to protect the site, relocate the ceremonies and remains to a new location, or accept the loss and consecrate a new sacred place. The emotional and spiritual dimensions of these decisions added to the practical challenges of adapting to rising seas. Some communities developed rituals around the abandonment of old settlements, formally closing one chapter of their history before beginning the next. These might involve final ceremonies at the old location, the removal of important items to be carried to the new settlement, and perhaps offerings or prayers marking the transition. Such rituals helped communities process the loss and provided clear markers between past and future. The settlement patterns on shifting shores ultimately demonstrated human adaptability and resilience. Communities found ways to maintain cultural continuity, social cohesion, and economic viability despite losing their homes repeatedly to advancing seas. They developed flexible settlement strategies that accepted impermanence while preserving what mattered most: knowledge, relationships, and cultural identity. The physical locations changed, but the communities endured. The experience of these ancient coastal communities resonates powerfully today as modern societies face rising seas due to climate change. We're not the first humans to struggle with relocating coastal settlements or to grieve the loss of places inundated by water. The archaeological record of ancient settlements on shifting shores offers both warnings about the challenges we'll face and inspiration about human capacity to adapt, even to dramatic environmental changes. Our ancestors survived the flooding of their world. Their story shows us that with flexibility, innovation, and community solidarity, we might survive the flooding of ours. Chapter 9. The technology of water. The water people. That's what they were becoming. With each generation, with every innovation in boat design and navigation technique, with each successful crossing of a channel that their ancestors would have thought impossible, humans were transforming from primarily terrestrial creatures into beings equally at home on water. This transformation required more than just boats. It demanded an entire suite of technologies specifically adapted to aquatic life, tools and techniques that our land-based ancestors never needed. The development of this water technology represents one of the great, innovative periods in human prehistory. Fishing technology led the way. Early humans had caught fish opportunistically, perhaps grabbing stranded fish from tidal pools or spearing fish in shallow streams. But as rising seas created vast new aquatic environments and people spent more time near and on water, fishing evolved from an occasional activity into a primary subsistence strategy. This required specialized tools far more sophisticated than the simple spears used for hunting land animals. Fishhooks were among the earliest specialized fishing technologies. The oldest known fishhooks, made from shells and bone, date back at least 23,000 years, but the technology likely developed even earlier. Creating an effective fishhook required understanding several principles. The hook had to be shaped to catch in a fish's mouth without allowing escape. It needed strength to hold struggling fish without breaking. The material had to resist corrosion from salt water and softening from prolonged immersion. The size and shape had to match the target species. What worked for small coastal fish was useless for large ocean fish. Manufacturing fishhooks from bone or shell was painstaking work. A piece of bone had to be carefully shaped, often using grinding techniques rather than the flaking used for stone tools. A groove had to be carved where a line would be attached. The point had to be sharpened. The entire process might take hours for a single hook, and hooks were easily lost. A successful fisherman needed multiple hooks and the skills to manufacture replacements. Fishing lines required equally sophisticated technology. Simple vines or strips of hide worked for crude fishing, but effective lines needed strength, flexibility, and resistance to water damage. Plant fibers processed into cordage provided the best combination of properties. Different plants offered different advantages. Some produced stronger fibers, others more flexible ones. Still others resisted rot better. Communities developed extensive knowledge about which plants produce the best fishing line and how to process them. Optimally.nets represented a major technological leap, allowing the capture of many fish simultaneously rather than one at a time with hooks or spears. Creating nets required several innovations. Cordage fine enough to weave, but strong enough to hold fish. Techniques for creating mesh patterns with proper spacing. Methods for adding weights to make nets sink and floats to suspend them at the right depth. An understanding of fish behavior to know where to place nets for maximum effectiveness. The oldest known fishing nets date back about 10,000 years. Preserved in waterlogged sites where organic materials survived. But the technology likely developed much earlier. Nets don't survive in most archaeological contexts, so their absence from older sites doesn't prove they didn't exist. The sophistication of these earliest preserved nets suggests a long development period, implying that nets were being woven and used during the late Ice Age flooding period. Fish traps represented another clever innovation. By constructing barriers and enclosures in tidal areas or river shallows, people could guide fish into traps that were easy to enter but difficult to escape. The advantage of traps was that they worked continuously once built, requiring minimal labor to maintain and harvest. A well-placed trap could provide reliable food with far less effort than active fishing. The construction of effective fish traps required detailed knowledge of fish behavior and tidal patterns. The trap had to be positioned where fish naturally moved. The entrance had to be sized and shaped to allow fish in while preventing escape. The materials had to withstand the forces of currents and waves while remaining permeable, enough that water could flow through. Different trap designs evolved for different environments and target species. Harpoons for hunting marine mammals required significant technological sophistication. Unlike spears for land hunting, which needed only to penetrate and kill, marine mammal hunting weapons had to deal with prey that could escape into water, diving deep or swimming away while wounded. Early marine hunters developed detachable harpoon heads attached to lines, allowing the hunter to maintain connection to wounded prey even as it attempted to escape. The engineering of detachable harpoons was clever. The head had to attach firmly enough to the shaft for throwing but detach on impact, remaining embedded in the prey while the shaft floated free. The line connecting the head to the hunter had to be strong enough to hold struggling prey yet light enough that it didn't impede the throw. The harpoon head itself had to be designed with barbs or toggles that prevented it from pulling free once embedded. Shellfish gathering tools were simpler but no less important. Digging sticks for clams, chisels for prying shellfish from rocks, baskets for carrying harvests. These unglamorous tools allowed exploitation of the enormous shellfish resources that flourished in newly created estuarine environments. The massive shell middens that mark ancient coastal settlements testify to the importance of shellfish in coastal diets. The processing of marine resources required specialized knowledge and tools. Fish had to be cleaned, often immediately after catching to prevent spoilage in warm weather. Shellfish had to be opened, their meat extracted and prepared. Large sea mammals had to be butchered, a major undertaking requiring specialized cutting tools and techniques. The preservation of marine resources for long-term storage demanded additional technologies: racks for drying fish, smoking techniques, methods for rendering and storing sea mammal oil. Water-resistant clothing and gear were essential for people spending significant time on or near water. Animal hides could be treated with oils and fats to make them water-resistant, though not fully waterproof. Gut skins from sea mammals, properly prepared, created material that was both waterproof and translucent, useful for creating water-resistant covers or windows in shelters. Some coastal groups developed remarkably effective waterproof clothing using these materials. Paddles evolved from simple clubs to sophisticated implements shaped for efficiency. The blade's width, thickness, and shape affected how easily it moved through water and how much force it generated with each stroke. The shaft's length determined leverage and stroke frequency. The grip where hands held the paddle had to be comfortable for extended use. Different paddle designs suited different boat types and water conditions. Narrow blades for rivers and fast boats. Wide blades for heavy cargo or calm water. Double-bladed paddles for narrow kayak-style boats. Anchors and mooring systems allowed boats to be secured in place. Crucial for fishing, for overnight stops, and for protecting boats from being carried away by currents or winds. The simplest anchors were just heavy stones tied to lines. More sophisticated versions used stones enclosed in woven frames that caught on the bottom more effectively. The development of reliable anchoring systems allowed exploitation of fishing grounds in deeper water and made overnight boat travel safer. Navigation tools remained relatively simple during this period. Sophisticated instruments like compasses and sextants wouldn't be invented for thousands of years. But early navigators did use various aids. Marked sticks or knotted strings might record distances traveled or numbers of days at sea. Star patterns could be memorized using mnemonic devices. Landmark features might be recorded through songs or stories that encoded navigational information in memorable form. The manufacture of salt represented an important coastal technology. Salt was valuable both as a food preservative and as a trade commodity. Coastal peoples could produce salt by evaporating seawater in shallow pans or by boiling seawater in clay vessels. The salt could then be used to preserve fish and meat or traded to inland groups who lacked direct access to ocean resources. Waterproofing technologies for boats required knowledge of natural adhesives and sealants. Pine resin, beeswax, animal fats, and various plant materials could be mixed to create compounds that sealed gaps in boat hulls and made joints waterproof. The right formula varied depending on local materials and boat construction methods. Communities developed proprietary mixtures whose recipes were closely guarded and passed down through generations. Bailing devices for removing water from boats were necessary even for well-built craft. Wave splash, rain, and mire leaks meant that boats gradually accumulated water that had to be removed. Simple containers, carved wooden bowls, or woven baskets with tight enough weave to hold water briefly served as bailers. The regular bailing required during boat travel was arduous, but necessary work. Storage containers for use on boats had to be waterproof or at least water-resistant to protect food, tools, and other supplies. Sewn leather bags treated with fat, tightly woven baskets, or wooden containers sealed with resin all served this purpose. The development of effective waterproof storage allowed longer voyages with adequate supplies and protected valuable trade goods during transport. Fire starting materials required special protection during boat travel. Keeping tinder dry when constantly exposed to spray and humidity was challenging, but essential. Losing your ability to start fire during an extended voyage could be fatal. Waterproof containers made from gutskin, sealed gourds, or resin-coated wood protected precious fire-starting materials. Some communities carried glowing coals in specially designed containers packed with slow-burning materials, maintaining fire through extended journeys. The technology of water people extended to food acquisition beyond just fishing. The harvesting of edible seaweeds required knowledge about which species were edible, when they were most nutritious, and how to process them for storage. Seabird egg collecting demanded understanding of nesting cycles and techniques for accessing nest sites on cliffs or remote islands. The gathering of other marine resources, sea urchins, octopuses, crabs, each required specialized knowledge and often specialized tools. Signals and communication across water required technologies adapted to the marine environment. Smoke signals worked well on calm days, but were useless in fog or high winds. Sound signals using horns made from shells or animal horns could carry across water, useful for maintaining contact between boats or signaling from shore. Visual signals using raised paddles, colored materials, or reflected sunlight provided another communication method. The accumulation of all these technologies, fishing gear, boats, navigation skills, processing techniques, waterproof containers, and countless other innovations transformed human capabilities. Early humans had been capable swimmers and could perhaps build crude rafts, but they were fundamentally terrestrial creatures.